Hi all. Today's session on budget management will cover good practice when rebaselining budgets. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Fiona Martin, a finance subject matter expert as part of the Delivery Associates Network. I work in finance transformation across government and public sector, and as part of that role, I've supported the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and also a number of local authorities. I'll begin today's session by confirming our understanding of a budget rebaseline, and we'll look at some of the situations where a budget rebaseline might arise. So a budget rebaseline is a formal revision of the original budget plan during a project or a programme. It's not simply an adjustment for actual variances, but it's a fundamental realignment of the budget to reflect significant changes to the project. Rebaselining the budget might involve rebaselining the value, but also the time horizon of the budget as well. A budget rebaseline may be necessary due to three key reasons. One, the changes to funding timelines. Two, to cost overruns. And three, due to programme delays. Most commonly, I see that budget rebaselines are necessary due to cost overruns. Typically, this may be due to inaccurate initial estimates of the project budget or significant changes in the project budget over time that may be due to scope creep or also due to other external factors. There's a number of key steps to consider when rebaselining budgets, noting that this list isn't exhaustive, but does provide a helpful list of key steps to consider. Firstly, linked to the previous slide, we'll want to identify the need for rebaselining, so determining those factors that indicate that a budget rebaseline is required. This might be obvious to yourself in the programme teams, but often identifying the need for rebaselining may need some stakeholder consultation with some of your internal teams, but also it may involve speaking to your external stakeholders and contractors as well to make sure that you're really getting under the skin for the need, getting under the skin to understand the need for rebaselining. Another important step is to conduct analysis of the budget. So that will be comparing your current forecasted costs and your forecasted timelines against the original baseline budget. So you'll want to pinpoint those specific variations or deviations from the forecast, and you'll want to quantify that variance to the extent possible. Where you're quantifying the variance, you need to make sure that you are considering cost, time and resource as well. Linked to the first point, you want to determine the root cause perhaps for each of those variances. Once you understand what the variance to the original budget is, you'll want to look at developing a revised budget. We'll touch on this in a little bit more detail shortly, but as part of developing your revised budget, it's important to consider internal and external evidence to ensure that that revised budget is rooted in evidence to the extent possible. There are different approaches to rebaselining. You may conduct a comprehensive overhaul, or you may carry out some more incremental changes to the budget. And I'd suggest consulting with your internal finance teams on that point before enacting the process of revising your budget. Because rebaselining your budget is a formal process, more often than not, you will require stakeholder approval. So please do consider as early as possible what stakeholder approvals might be required, considering both informal and formal governance forums within your local authority. Before taking the budget rebaseline to any forums, I would make sure that you are speaking to internal stakeholders to get their view or any challenge of the proposed budget rebaseline. So that may include consulting your finance stakeholders or any other enabling functions. It's very important to make sure that you have secured approval from those relevant parties and governance forums before you proceed with the rebaseline budget. Once the budget has been rebaselined, please do ensure that you update your project documentation. So that might include your project plans, your budgets, your benefit tracking documentation and risk registers as well. Further, you'll want to make sure that you're communicating updates to all relevant parties so everyone is aware that the budget rebaseline has taken place and can understand what budget that you are now working to, including the time horizon. It's important to make sure that you do have an audit trail of each of the steps that are shown on this slide to make sure that you're in line with monitoring and control requirements in your organisation. You may also want to consider and document any lessons learned as part of the rebaselining process, but also considering lessons learned relating to the need for rebaselining in the first place. As I mentioned, we're going to look at good practice to achieve the most realistic financial projections when you're carrying out your rebaseline. We're going to look at this in the context of common pitfalls and the corresponding good practice. So as I mentioned, rebaselining your budget should be rooted in evidence to the furthest extent possible. So what we may commonly see is that projects rely on internal information when rebaselining and therefore don't seek third-party supplier or contractor spend on the expected value or time horizon of spend. And where they receive that information, teams may not sufficiently challenge that information to make sure that they really understand it and try and receive more assurance of how robust that information might be. So what we do suggest is that you request a third-party supplier information as early as possible when you are aware that you're going to rebaseline the budget on your project. Make sure that you spend time understanding the information that's received and challenge those financial projections, including any underlying assumptions, as these pieces of information are likely to be key inputs to the rebaselined budgets. Next, common pitfalls that we might see is that unrealistic forecasts in terms of value, but also unrealistic forecasts in terms of time horizon are set. Inherently, project teams may be overly optimistic in the value of the budget that they are expecting to spend and also in the related time horizon. So what we suggest to do, again, rooting the rebaselining in as much evidence as possible, is reviewing the existing run rate of spend on your projects to ascertain and to stress test if the rate of spend that you're forecasting or is currently set is realistic for the project. Again, make sure that you understand and document any assumptions or contingency factors that underpin updated forecasts. It's also important to consider communication when asking teams for updated forecasts, making sure that you're communicating the positive narrative of resetting your budgets to achieve a more balanced footing on your project. When considering the realism of time horizons on the project, I would make sure that the SRO or project leadership can see a transparent view of the updated spend profile. That will again encourage further challenge and review to make sure that the updated project budget is as realistic as possible. Do also consider the time horizon impact on your benefits and when you expect that those will be realised. Again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail shortly. Often when teams are rebaselining projects, we will see that teams don't consult the risks register. So what we do suggest is that when you're rebaselining budget, you should have a deep dive and more frequent reviews of the risk register. One, to make sure that the risks that are already captured on the risk register do inform your updated budget expectations. But secondly, to make sure that there's no missing risks from your risk register. So perhaps some of those factors which indicated that a budget rebaseline is necessary may not have been captured on the risk register. We see that quite often. So making sure that your risk register is full and up to date. When rebaselining your budgets, we'll want, apologies, when rebaselining budgets, there's a number of levers that you might be able to take to help to manage your project risk. So one of those is seeking clarity on your committed expenditure. So particularly where you are looking at cost overruns on the project, then it's helpful to seek clarity on what spend is committed and is therefore essential, for example, your contractual obligations versus any desirable spend, which may be uncommitted spend. Where you're looking to reduce costs, then you may be able to pull some levers there to reduce the non-essential spend or reduce the uncommitted expenditure, but only to the extent possible that you can deliver the project within the clarified scope. Secondly, you may want to consider funding sources. So where there are cost overruns, are there other funding sources available throughout the local authority to close your funding gap? For example, we have seen that where there's underspends on other levelling up projects across the portfolio, you may appropriately be able to use those to help closing the funding gap, but please do consider any approvals that are required to manage that. There may be wider non-levelling up funding that can contribute to closing the funding gap. Again, you may need to consider the approvals that are required here. Particularly where there's pressure on time horizon, there could be scope to bring forward spend. What I would consider in this scenario is speaking to any contractors and suppliers to ask the question, can they generally bring forward spend into the agreed funding window? This may reduce some of the need for the budget rebaseline, but it's a good idea to ask the question to be as clear as possible on the timelines that you're considering here. Please do speak with your finance colleagues to ensure that resource accounting is considered when bringing forward spend. That essentially means that we're making sure that the spend is captured in the appropriate financial period. Finally, considering project scope is also a helpful lever to consider. Once you have rebaselined your budget or where you're looking at different options, consider, can you still deliver against the funding conditions while reducing or changing the scope of the project slightly? This would need to be performed in quite close consultation with your project leadership, but it is one option to consider when delivering the project, but maybe changing the goalpost slightly. Again, think about the knock-on impact on benefits, but also on your project business case here, and that there may need to be some changes required. Ultimately, where it's difficult to manage the levers, there could be the need for a scheduled project pause. Again, something to consider with project leadership. Looking at risk and uncertainty in a little bit more detail, a common pitfall when rebaselining budgets is that optimism bias and contingency aren't appropriately dealt with. Projects may completely eliminate the contingency allowance where considerable risks remain, or conversely, projects may not consult or review their contingency allowance throughout the period of the project. So an inappropriate allowance remains. What we would suggest when rebaselining budget is conducting a review or a deep dive on the treatment of optimism bias and contingency levels. Previously, I'd mentioned conducting a review also of your risk register. So where you're reviewing your optimism bias and contingency levels, that should be performed in conjunction with the review of the risk register as well. Noting where rebaselining projects, this might be at quite a mature stage of the project. So what we would expect to see is that your optimism bias and contingency levels are coming down. So it may be inappropriate to have static optimism bias or contingency levels that haven't moved since the start of the project. But please do be prudent when managing your project risk. I've mentioned benefits a couple of times thus far, but once you have rebaselined your project, it's important to look at benefits realisation and make sure that you're communicating any changes to your benefits as well. So when you are rebaselining your benefits, look at your benefits realisation to consider any benefits that might have actually been achieved to date, and make sure that you are logging and communicating those benefits that have been achieved. But actually, there may be a knock-on impact to the value of benefits, but also the time horizon of benefits as well. So make sure you capture that within your benefits tracking. Again, something that has been mentioned before, but make sure you are updating the underlying project documentation, documenting any lessons learned, and then later down the line, make sure that you are sustaining any benefits that have been captured.